Imagine a corridor of polished stone lit by latticed windows and oil lamps. It is quiet, but not still. The faint rustle of silk, the stepped rhythm of slippers, a distant murmur of women conversing in languages from faraway provinces and distant seas. Behind carved doors, the private world of an emperor or a sultan unfolds. Tutors teach calligraphy and poetry. Physicians blend medicines, mothers bargain for their sons' futures, and servants carry sealed notes to powerful ministers. This is the harem, an inner court, a family space, and a political engine. In popular imagination, harems are scenes of indolent pleasure. History is more complicated. Across three great empires, the Chinese dynasties centered at the Forbidden City, the Ottoman world at Topkapı Palace, and the Mughal courts of Hindustan, the harem was a guarded institution where dynastic survival, diplomacy, and domestic governance converged. These were spaces of privacy and protection, but also of rivalry, education, patronage, and power. Women inside could be cultural patrons and political actors. Men outside learned quickly that the door to the throne room often opened or closed in the women's wing. This documentary explores famous harems and the secret harems, the unofficial or shadowed networks that operated beyond visitor eyes. We will move carefully through time and place, naming people, dates, laws, palaces, and crises to see how these inner worlds shaped the outer world. How a consort in Beijing could redirect imperial ritual, how a Valid Sultan in Istanbul could appoint a Grand Vizier, and how a Mughal Empress in Agra could steer trade and succession. The word harem comes through Arabic harem, what is inviolable, protected, private. In Islamic empires, it referred to the family's women's quarters. In China, a different language, hugong, the rear palace, or inner court, organized the emperor's domestic realm. But the concept was similar, an inner, guarded household at the heart of supreme rule. In the Indian subcontinent, Persianate courts used zenana, the women's quarters, and practiced purdah, the protocol of seclusion. Though the terms differ, each tradition balanced privacy, honor, and dynastic order. Chinese imperial households integrated the harem into state structure from deep antiquity. By the Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE, ranks among imperial women were codified. By the Tang, 618 to 907, the 6 palaces housed consorts of specific grades, and by the Ming, 1368 to 1644, and Qing, 1644 to 1912, the hierarchy was formalized down to titles, costumes, stipends, and rituals. At the top stood the Empress, Huang He, followed by the imperial noble consort, Huang Guifei, noble consorts, Guifei, consorts, Fei, and concubines, Pin, followed by several lower ranks. Selection typically occurred through periodic drafts of elegant women, xuanxiu, drawing candidates from elite families and banner communities. The inner court was staffed by palace women, gongnu, and supervised in the Qing era by the imperial household department, nei wufu, working in parallel with eunuchs and officials of the outer court. The harem was not merely domestic. It was a bureaucracy of intimacy, with rosters, ledgers, and rules. The Ottoman harem crystallized in the 15th and 16th centuries, centered at Topkapı Palace in Istanbul after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. It drew on Seljuk, Byzantine, and broader Islamic household traditions, but developed distinctive ranks and offices. At the apex stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, often the most powerful woman in the empire. Below were the Haseki Sultan, chief consort in some periods, the Kadın Efendileri, principal women, later usually 4, the Iqbal and Gözde, favored women, and a sophisticated hierarchy of stewards. The Hazinedar Usta, chief treasurer of the harem, the Kathuda Kadın, chief administrator, and the powerful eunuchs, especially the Kızlar Ağası, chief of the black eunuchs, who controlled access, movement, and correspondence. The harem population varied by century but could number in the hundreds, even over 1,000 at its peak, including servants, tutors, and apprentices. The Mughals, Timurid in origin and Persianate in culture, ruled from 1526 to the 19th century in the subcontinent. Their zenana was both domestic and administrative, a personal sanctuary and a locus of patronage. Akbar R. 1556 to 1605 reorganized court and household, formalizing the women's quarters and establishing protocols for security and access. Royal women: Hamida Banu Begum, Akbar's mother; Mariam-uz-Zamani, a Rajput princess and Akbar's influential consort; Nur Jahan, Jahangir's powerful wife; Mumtaz Mahal, Shah Jahan's beloved; and Jahanara Begum, Shah Jahan's daughter, shaped trade, architecture, charity, and politics. Eunuchs known as Khwaja Sara acted as guardians, stewards, and messengers. The zenana had its own workshops, treasuries, and rules, and corresponded with governors and merchants far beyond the palace walls. Each imperial harem had its own grammar of power. In China, a woman's rank determined her apartment's location within the Forbidden City, her robe's color and embroidery, her attendance, and her proximity to ritual. Those who bore sons, especially if a son rose to heir apparent, gained prestige and patronage opportunities. Education emphasized calligraphy, poetry, music, ritual etiquette, and sometimes state classics. Illness care, birth protocols, and mourning rites followed precise calendars. The rhythm of the inner court was regulated by bells, drums, and registers. Eunuchs and palace women maintained meticulous logs: which consort was summoned to the imperial bedchamber on which night, which feast required which vessels, which birthdays and ancestral rites demanded which offerings. Ottoman training took in languages, religion, embroidery, music, and palace protocol. Girls entered young and advanced through service and instruction. Many were manumitted and married off in carefully arranged alliances, part of an Ottoman social mobility system that placed trained women in the households of officials and provincial elites, creating an empire-wide network loyal to the dynasty. Within Topkapı, rules of movement were strict. Routes, gates, and courtyards divided the women's world from the administrative core. The Golden Road, a long corridor connecting the Sultan's private rooms to the harem, embodied this link, a physical conduit for the flow of intimacy and influence. In the Mughal zenana, elite women supervised household production on a grand scale: textiles, perfumes, jewel settings, and elaborate cuisine. They commissioned mosques, gardens, and sarais, caravanserais, distributed arms, and sponsored scholars and Sufi orders. Education included Persian literature, Quranic studies, calligraphy, and practical estate management. The zenana was a city within a city. At Agra Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, and the Red Fort in Shahjahanabad, screened pavilions and jolly windows allowed women to observe processions without being seen, while inner courtyards were animated by music, storytelling, and festival rites. Secret harems do not necessarily mean clandestine pleasure houses. Rather, they were the unseen networks that extended the power of the official women's quarters: secondary residences, dowager palaces, provincial mansions, and patronage webs that functioned like parallel inner courts. In China, widowed empresses and imperial dowagers often moved between the main palace and side compounds, controlling factions through eunuch intermediaries. Informal salons inside the inner court, rooms where poetry was copied or embroidery patterns exchanged, could become caucus grounds. A senior consort's brother in the outer court might receive appointments and gifts contingent on her favor. The paper trail, memorials annotated by a dowager's hand, sealed packets carried by a trusted eunuch, rarely reached the official chronicles, but the outcomes did: promotions, exiles, and altered successions. In the Ottoman world, the Old Palace, Eski Saray, at times housed widowed or displaced royal women, generating its own alliances. The Valide Sultan's apartments formed a court within the court, where ambassadors' wives sought audiences. Provincial governors cultivated private harems that mirrored Topkapı's ranks, and marriages of manumitted harem women to officials created webs of loyalty from Damascus to Baghdad. The cafes, the cage, secluded apartments where potential heirs lived under watch, was not a harem in the female sense, but it was a secret domestic world shaping the succession politics that the harem's senior women navigated. In the Mughal system, royal ladies maintained estates, ships, and trade capital. Mariam-uz-Zamani famously owned the pilgrim ship Raham, sailing from Surat on the Arabian Sea. Her commercial interests linked the zenana to the mercantile world. Princess Jahanara's Sufi networks and market patronage in Shahjahanabad formed a socio-religious harem of influence, no less real for being outside the literal screened chambers. These soft power circuits, charities, endowments, dowries, and letters were hidden in plain sight. By the 16th and 17th centuries, all three harems had reached mature form. In China, the Ming and then the Qing established exacting court ritual. In the Ottoman Empire, the reign of Suleyman I, 1520 to 1566, and his consort Hürrem ushered in an age later called the Sultanate of Women. In Mughal India, Akbar and Jahangir normalized the zenana as a space of governance as well as kinship. Across these worlds, palace women and eunuchs, named and unnamed, would decide the fates of ministers and princes. In the next part, we enter the drama of personalities and crises to see how the inner court steered the ship of state. Begin at Topkapı Palace in the mid-16th century. Hürrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, arrived at the Ottoman court as a concubine, likely of Ruthenian origin. She rose from favored consort to Haseki Sultan, a revolutionary elevation cemented by a formal marriage to Sultan Süleyman I around the 1530s, a departure from Ottoman custom that made royal sons by concubines, not wives, to avoid external dynastic alliances. Hürrem established charitable complexes in Istanbul and Jerusalem and engaged in statecraft corresponding with foreign rulers. Her ascent set the tone for a century when women at the palace's apex, Nurbanu Sultan, mother of Murad III, Safiye Sultan, consort of Murad III and mother of Mehmed III, Kösem Sultan, consort of Ahmed I and kingmaker for multiple sultans, and Turhan Sultan, mother of Mehmed IV, exercised decisive power. The Valide Sultan's authority combined maternal legitimacy with control of palace appointments. The Kızlar Ağası, chief of the black eunuchs, gatekept access to the harem and the sultan, mediated petitions, and managed endowments. Grand viziers and janissary agars learned to read harem winds as carefully as battle reports. One of the most dramatic episodes is the rivalry between Kösem Sultan and her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, in the 1640s to 1650s. Kösem, once regent for her sons Murad IV and Ibrahim, became guardian for her young grandson Mehmed IV in 1648. Turhan, as the child's mother, was poised to become Valide, but Kösem eclipsed her, projecting authority as Büyük Valide, Great Mother. Factional struggles, janissary interests, court financiers, and palace households coalesced behind each woman. In 1651, palace intrigues reached a fatal climax. Kösem was strangled, almost certainly at Turhan's instigation or with her faction's support. Turhan assumed the Valide's place and soon backed the Köprülü family's rise, appointing Köprülü Mehmed Pasha as Grand Vizier in 1656. The empire stabilized. The Ottoman ship of state, rocked by internal strife and external wars, found direction because a woman in the harem chose a capable strongman and then let him govern. This was not an isolated tale. In earlier decades, Hürrem's rivalry with Mahidevran, mother of Suleiman's first son Mustafa, helped shape succession politics that ended with Prince Mustafa's execution in 1553, an act infamous for its cruelty, but deeply rooted in the Ottoman law of fratricide logic, meant to prevent civil war. Hürrem's sons Selim II and Bayezid struggled. Bayezid's rebellion ended in his death in 1561. Every step, marriages, postings of princes to provincial governorships, the flow of gifts to janissaries, was watched in the harem as on a chessboard where moves were counted in lives. In China, the list spans centuries, but two figures frame the conversation. First is Wu Zetian, ruling as Emperor 690 to 705, who began as a concubine of Emperor Taizong in the Tang court, later became consort and then Empress to Emperor Gaozong, and upon his illness and death engineered a political rise unmatched by any other woman in Chinese history. Her reign as emperor, founding the short-lived Zhou dynasty, grew from harem skills, forging alliances, mastering ritual language, and reading court factions. Second is Empress Dowager Cixi, 1835 to 1908, who entered the Qing court as a low-ranking consort to the Xianfeng emperor and rose to become the de facto ruler of the empire after the 1861 Xinyu coup. With Prince Gong and Empress Dowager Qian, she sidelined regents, presided behind a screen over audiences, and steered the empire through self-strengthening reforms, foreign wars, and internal uprisings. Cixi's critics accused her of extravagance, most famously diverting funds to rebuild the Summer Palace after the destruction of the old Summer Palace in 1860. Yet her defenders note that she balanced conservative ritual with selective modernization. Whether praised or blamed, she embodied the harem's permeable boundary with state power. Other Chinese harem figures include Consort Zhen, Zhen Fei, 1876 to 1900, a favored consort of the Guangxu Emperor, remembered for her support of the 100 Days Reform in 1898. As conservative forces reasserted control, Zhen's fate became a symbol. In 1900, as the court fled the Boxer crisis, she was drowned in a palace well, an execution that reads like a dark footnote to reformist ambition. The Chinese inner court was a theater of ritual punctuated by occasional shocks. During late Ming, powerful eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian, 1568 to 1627, dominated politics, exploiting his access to the emperor's person and the palace women. Wei reorganized the palace staff and punished opponents through secret police mechanisms, feeding on the harem's informational monopoly. His fall after Emperor Tianqi's death, and the purges that followed, show how the inner palace could incubate a state within a state, and how a single death at the apex could bring the edifice crashing down. During the Guangxu Emperor's ill-fated 100 Days Reform, June to September 1898, reform edicts sought to modernize administration, military, and education. The harem stood at the axis. Guangxu's reformist circle collided with Cixi's conservative court. When Cixi moved against Guangxu, placing him under house arrest within the Forbidden City, the inner court became a gilded prison. The drowning of consort Zhen in 1900 crystallized the darker side of palace secrecy. The same seclusion that sheltered the imperial family also concealed lethal decisions. Not all harem stories end in blood. The court was a crucible of art. Tang-era literary salons produced verse by palace women. In the Ming and Qing, embroidery ateliers in the inner court created masterworks of silk and gold thread. Ritual banquets followed printed menus specifying vessels and dishes. Birthdays and seasonal sacrifices became choreographed spectacles. These routines channeled power outward. A dowager's charitable gifts signaled stability to the capital's guilds. A selection draft bound provincial elites to the throne through daughterly ties. Both the Ottoman and Chinese harems fused family and state. Each developed a formal hierarchy marrying intimacy to law. Titles, stipends, apartments, and dress codes rendered domestic relations legible to the bureaucracy. Each relied on intermediaries, eunuchs, senior stewards, trusted ladies-in-waiting, who managed the flow of information and gifts. Each could become a bottleneck where reform stalled or a lever that moved the empire when a decisive woman acted. There were crucial differences. The Ottoman harem produced public philanthropists. The Valide or a Haseki might endow mosques, schools, and soup kitchens bearing her name, visibly inscribing her authority on the cityscape. The Chinese inner court, more tightly ritualized and Confucian in ideology, kept the Empress's public presence muted. Her power expressed itself through rites, appointments, and the rhythm of the palace year. Yet in crisis, the strangling of Kösem in 1651, the house arrest of Guangxu in 1898, the inner court's concealed decisions thundered across the empire. In both worlds, secret harems amounted to shadow governance, antechambers, side palaces, and private apartments where patronage lists were compiled and punishments decided. In Istanbul, the old palace and manumitted women's marriages created a diaspora of harem-trained elites. In Beijing, the imperial household department's ledgers and the eunuch postal routes stitched a quiet web, with a dowager's brushstroke on a memorial altering a provincial governor's fate. To understand why wars were waged or reforms delayed, diplomats learned to read not only the imperial edicts, but also the corridors where they were drafted. In the next part, we turn to the Mughal Zenana, its queens, princesses, and guardians, and then trace the aftermath and legacy across all three empires, how the women's quarters dissolved or transformed, and how their influence lingers in cities, laws, and memories. Begin with Akbar the Great, R. 1556 to 1572, 1556 to 1605. The organization of his household shaped Mughal norms for generations. Akbar's mother, Hamida Banu Begum, enjoyed ceremonial precedence and advised on marriage alliances and courtly piety. One of the most influential women was Mariam-uz-Zamani, a Rajput princess from Amer, often identified with Harkabai. As Akbar's consort and the mother of Jahangir, she mediated between the Timurid court and Rajput houses. Beyond motherhood, she was a financier and merchant. Records attest to her ownership of large ships operating out of Surat on the Arabian Sea and to her extensive charitable endowments. Jahangir's reign, R. 1605 to 1627, elevated perhaps the most famous Mughal empress, Nur Jahan, born Mehrun-Nisa. Married to Jahangir in 1611, she rapidly became a partner in governance. Coins in parts of the empire bore her name. Farmans, royal orders, went out under her seal. She presided at audiences and organized hunts. Nur Jahan's family, her father, Mirza Ghiyas Beg, titled Itimad-ud-Dawla, and her brother Asaf Khan, formed a political household that steered appointments and diplomacy. Her rivalries, especially around succession, rippled outward. Prince Hürrem, the future Shah Jahan, clashed with her faction before claiming the throne. Under Shah Jahan, R. 1628 to 1658, the Zenana continued to matter. Mumtaz Mahal, beloved consort and mother to many of his children, died in 1631 in Burhanpur. The Taj Mahal in Agra became her marble epitaph. Their daughter Jahanara Begum emerged as Padshah Begum, chief lady of the court. Jahanara patronized Sufi orders, endowed a great market, Chandni Chowk, in Delhi, and acted as diplomat among quarreling brothers during the War of Succession. Her sister Roshanara Begum took the opposite side, aligning with Aurangzeb, whose eventual victory in 1658 inaugurated a stricter, more pious regime. Through it all, Khwajasara guardians held keys and carried intelligence. Their loyalty to particular princes or princesses could shift the balance in the dead of night. One episode captures the Zenana's reach into global politics, the affair of the ship Raham. Owned by Mariam-uz-Zamani, the vessel carried pilgrims and precious cargo. In 1613, Portuguese privateers seized the Raham near Deo, provoking Jahangir's ire and a backlash against Portuguese enclaves. beneath the diplomatic cables lay a quiet truth. A queen's commercial interests linked the screened chambers of Agra to the currents of the Arabian Sea and the imperial calculus of coastal warfare. The Zenana was not an island, it was a port. Under Jahangir, Nur Jahan's ascent transformed palace routines. She held court from behind a screen, received ladies of ambassadors, and issued grants to poets and widows. When Jahangir's health faltered, Nur Jahan's household became the nerve center. Her seal validated orders. Her father and brother acted as chief ministers. Succession anxieties sharpened. Prince Khurram rebelled and then reconciled. Prince Shahryar, Nur Jahan's son-in-law, emerged as her preferred candidate. When Jahangir died in 1627, a violent succession followed. Asaf Khan maneuvered to seat Khurram as Shah Jahan and eliminated Shahryar. Nur Jahan retired from politics, yet her built legacy, gardens and the exquisite tomb of her parents at Agra, endured as stone arguments for her taste and authority. During Shah Jahan's reign, the Zenana's center of gravity lay with Jahanara. In 1644, she was burned in a wardrobe accident and nearly died. Her recovery inspired an outpouring of endowments and a heightened aura of sanctity. When the emperor fell ill in 1657, the princes' war of succession ensued. Darashikoh, Shuja, Murad, and Aurangzeb jockeyed for the throne. The Zenana became a diplomatic theatre. Jahanara wrote letters, sought reconciliations, and later, under Aurangzeb, maintained influence through piety and charity. Roshanara, in contrast, facilitated Aurangzeb's coup. Shah Jahan ended his days confined in Agra fort, his view of the Taj Mahal uninterrupted. A daughter, Jahanara, chose to share his confinement, softening a hard political story with filial devotion. By the 18th and 19th centuries, each harem system faced upheaval. Ottoman. The court migrated from Topkapı's medieval sobriety to the European-style Dolmabahce Palace in the mid-19th century. Reformist sultans trimmed the janissaries, abolished in 1826, and adopted new administrative forms. The imperial harem's political centrality waned. After the Young Turk Revolution, 1908, and the deposition of Abdulhamid II, 1909, the old harem politics were largely spent. In 1924, with the abolition of the caliphate and the exile of the dynasty, the remaining harem women received stipends and left palace life, an institution dissolved into memory. China. The Qing court struggled with foreign invasion, internal rebellion, and fiscal strain. The Boxer Crisis, 1900, the new policies reforms, and the 1911 revolution ended the dynasty. The last emperor, Puyi, abdicated in February 1912, but remained in the Forbidden City until 1924. When expelled, the palace staff dispersed. Eunuchs lost their stations. Consorts and courtwomen navigated a new republic where the inner court had no legal standing. The harem system, 2 millennia old, vanished within a decade. Mughal. The empire fragmented under pressure from Marathas, Afghans, regional Nawabs, and eventually the British. After the 1857 uprising, the British ended the Mughal court in Delhi. The Zenana culture survived in princely states and elite households, but its imperial form receded. Women of these circles increasingly engaged with colonial modernity, founding schools, writing memoirs, and negotiating new public roles. Why did harems matter? Because they were the dynastic heart. Succession, who became emperor or sultan, often hinged on motherhood and the alliances forged in the women's quarters. Administration, who got appointed where, could depend on letters carried by eunuchs and favors bestowed in inner salons. Culture, what cities looked like and which arts flourished, bore women's signatures. Haseki Hürrem's complex in Istanbul, Kösem and Turhan's endowments, Nur Jahan's Agra tombs and gardens, Jahanara's Chandni Chowk and Sufi patronage, Chinese empresses' sponsorship of rituals, textiles, and palace architecture. Harems were also systems of education and mobility. Girls captured or purchased into the Ottoman harem learned languages, court rules, and crafts. Many were freed and married to officials, becoming nodes in an imperial network. Mughal princesses mastered Persian letters and Sufi etiquette, turning piety into political capital. Chinese consorts studied ritual and poetry, their mastery of the calendar and the canon giving them leverage in the liturgical state. Within constraints, real and sometimes brutal, women acted with purpose. And they were systems of secrecy. The secret harems were not figments, but the informal rooms, side palaces, and household diasporas that shaped policy without leaving tidy archives. Historians reconstruct them from account books, endowment deeds, travelers' reports, and random survivals. A coin bearing a woman's name, a ship's log from Surat, a memorial with a dowager's neat correction in red ink. These fragments reveal a political truth. Proximity to the ruler matters, and in these empires the closest corridors were lined with screens. Walk the golden road of Topkapı today. The tiles are cool, the rooms quiet. Imagine Hürrem conferring with a steward. Picture Turhan weighing the fate of Kösem and of the empire. Cross to Beijing. The Forbidden City's red walls hold courtyards, where an empress once monitored the cosmic clock, and where a reformist consort met a well's dark water. Travel to Agra. The Taj Mahal shimmers over the Yamuna, testament to a love story, yes, but also to a household's power and sorrow. Nearby, Itimadud-Dowlah's tomb captures Nur Jahan's eye for stone and light. In Old Delhi, Chandni Chowk still hums with trade along the route Jahanara imagined. The laws are different now. Republics and nation-states dismantled palaces, abolished ranks, and rewrote civil codes. Yet echoes persist. The Ottoman Vakuf, the Chinese ritual calendar, the Mughal garden, in these, the harem's patronage lives on. In literature and film, the harem is often a fantasy of luxury or cruelty. History asks us to see institutions, not just interiors. Here were schools of governance disguised as households, cabinets without portfolios, parliaments whose members signed with bracelets rather than seals. In the end, the harem was a paradox, a place of seclusion that radiated power, a women's world that defined men's destinies, a domestic sphere that doubled as a statecraft workshop. Its famous figures, Hürrem, Kösem, Turhan, Zetian, Cixi, Consort Zhen, Mariam-uz-Zamani, Nur Jahan, Jahanara, were not merely inhabitants of rooms, but authors of chapters in imperial history. Their decisions sailed ships, minted coins, raised mosques, and ended wars. Their rivalries crowned sultans and toppled ministers. Their signatures, sometimes invisible, lie beneath the visible city we inherit. As we leave these palaces, the lamps snuff out, the corridors go dark, and the screens close. But the story does not end. It is written into stone inscriptions, embroidered into silk borders, and whispered in the rhythm of markets that still bear their names. And when we ask how empires rose, changed, and fell, we must remember the hands that turned the keys, the hands behind the screens, in the famous harems and the secret harems, where the private became public and the quiet decided the loud.